Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everyone, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I am joined by philosopher and Georgetown University professor Jason Brennan. Jason is the author or co-author of many books, including Why Not Capitalism, Markets Without Limits, Against Democracy, In Defense of Openness, Debating Democracy, which we discussed in episode 24, and the book we're discussing today, Democracy, A Guided Tour. Jason, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So I think this is your fifth book on democracy. Can you say briefly what this book is about and also how this topic came to be so central in your work?
Yeah, thanks. What makes this book different is it's sort of an intellectual history for people who don't care about intellectual history for its own sake. You know, what I mean by that is I'm not out there studying the ideas of the past because I want to, just be historically informed, but rather I want to sort of see how the debates about democracy have evolved over time. And so what this book is really about is not me presenting my view, but looking at how people have thought about democracy for the past 2,500 years in the West, what values they were focusing on. And in a way, it ends up being a democracy for and against book between multiple sets of authors on 5 different major topics or things that people might care about, reasons why they might think democracy is good or bad. And so, it's kind of interesting to write it. It wasn't my idea to write this in the first place. It was actually an editor at Oxford who had an idea for a series like this and wanted to sort of test it out with me as the first author. And, then we kind of constructed it and went from there. I got to say, one reason I'm working in democratic theory as a field is because I think it's so bad. I'll just be flat out frank and say that. What I meant by that is like when I was a graduate student, I would like once in a while, I was studying ethics and political philosophy and I wasn't really working in democratic theory per se. And once in a while I would like jump in and like read stuff in there. And it just seemed like highfalutin nonsense. It was kind of like people would try to defend completely like they would defend democracy, not as we see it. And not even like in these like highfalutin models and highfalutin language has nothing to do with the real world. And they weren't even just trying to say, well, democracy would be good if only people were a lot different. They were trying to defend real world democracy by ignoring real world democracy and on the basis of the kinds of values that no one other than a political theorist could ever care about. And it was just so divorced from reality. It just kind of basically seemed almost cultish to me. Like, what are these people talking about? Why don't they pay attention to the world? What does this have to do? Like, who cares about these supposed values that they think underpin democracy? And why would they think there's anything to do with actual governments as we see them? And then eventually at some point I realized, the fact that I think the field is so bad is reason to work in it. I can be a gadfly, I can walk in and go, yeah, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, and try to make things better in a way. So I feel like a lot of my work in democratic theory starts with saying something like, you are also presupposing certain empirical claims which turn out not to be true. That makes your sort of normative model of democracy irrelevant to what we actually see. And then this leaves open all this new work for us to do about how to think about democracy once we get the facts right.
You mentioned values that only like a political theorist could care about. I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind, but I'm picturing democratic theorists say things like, not giving everyone a vote fails to adequately show respect for the judgment of all citizens or something. And then that's supposed to be like, well, so obviously we have to do it. But then if you ask real people, like, how much do you care if something fails to show adequate respect for your judgment? And they might say, I don't care. Why are we supposed to care about this value if people don't care about it themselves? Is that the kind of thing you have in mind?
Yeah, even that one is better than what I have. I mean, there is something like kind of fishy about that kind of argument, but I do think even real lay people get concerned about this stuff. It is the kind of thing where intellectuals care about it more than normal people. But you do see people marching in the streets asking for a vote because they recognize in some cases when the government has failed to give them a vote, that's like the government's way of saying F you, you're second class. So I think even real people get interested in that. But I think, just really weird stuff like if I had to give an example of the book I have in mind, that's just like, what are you talking about? I would say like Suzanne Dovey has this book called The Good Representative, and it's meant to be a theory of what makes someone a good political representative. But the kinds of ideas about value that she has, it's like only someone who's got a PhD in political theory from a political science department would ever think this way. And it's all trying to like sort of sneak in arguments by like loading up the concept of democracy with all these like values so that like it becomes trivially true that like what it is to be democratic is to be a good representative and stuff. I won't get too much into it because it's just that would be like an example. Someone's like look on Amazon and be like, what are you talking about? That's what I mean. Like what does this have to do with the real world?
It makes me think a little bit about monarchy. One argument for monarchy has been that historically, people don't much argue for it anymore, has been that some monarchs are divinely ordained or even descended from the gods. And that strikes us today as, at best superstition and at worst just a lie to justify power. So, I mean, are you saying that like there are lots of arguments for democracy today that may eventually be seen that way or that you see that way now, essentially, just a little bit dressed up for modern ears?
Yeah, for sure. And I think was it Jeremy Waldron who said this maybe 20 or 30 years ago? Someone said the point that you just made in some famous article that I really should know. And they said something like a lot of what's happened in democratic theory is people still accept the old divine command view or the divine ordination view. But rather than the king has the right to rule and that like all the mystique of the king, they want to put that on all the people, right? All of us together share in that kind of mystique, right? And so one way of putting this is when you think about what fundamentally justifies democracy at a really abstract level, some people think of democracy as good in and of itself, apart from what it does. Some people care about what it expresses, and some people care about how it performs, right? So I tend to be the kind of person who thinks when we're judging what makes democracy good or bad, what we should judge is like how well it performs compared to alternative systems we could live under. But a lot of philosophers are very attracted to the idea of like, we don't have to look at the performance of democracy in order to say whether it's good or bad. And I'm not sure why that is. It might just be when you live in the ivory tower, you get really interested in these kind of semiotic and symbolic values. It could also be something weird like philosophers and political theorists don't have much skill in assessing empirics. Like if you ask somebody, is the minimum wage going to overall increase or decrease the real wages of workers, and what other effects will it have? A philosopher has no special training in assessing that, like figuring that out. That's a job for economists. So philosophers, I think, often are very attracted to arguments where they can judge an institution as just or unjust, but they don't have to do any empirical work. They don't know how to do it. They don't really like reading it. So if we can come up with some sort of purely philosophical argument that makes something good or bad, and then we're like, our work is done and we didn't have to actually look at the world, I think they tend to find that really attractive. It's sort of a pathology of the field.
I'm not sure about the author you were just talking about, but I know Herbert Spencer had an article in the 1800s called the Great Political Superstition. And it's the punchline is replacing the divine right of kings with the divine right of majorities. I don't remember the details of the article, but yeah, I think it's probably an old point. What do you think are some of the biggest differences in the types of arguments you see about democracy in the ancient world versus now?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting to see how it's changed because early on, when you read older work, it's mostly focused on stability and virtue. So, but I mean by stability is, will this political system last? Will it lead to civil war or internal conflict? And I don't mean internal conflict of the sort like, my neighbor and I don't want to talk to each other because we vote for different parties. I mean, actual fist fighting and stabbing and violence and so on. Will it cause the political system to collapse or break off into little pieces? Because we have to realize that for most of history, political order was quite unstable. Empires were rising and falling. Kings were being replaced by other kings. The kind of constitution your government might have could change like month to month. It might be the sort of thing where you're an aristocracy for 15 years, then all of a sudden you're a dictatorship, and then you're a democracy for 10 years, and then you're something else. And then there's continuous and constant war and conflict, and the percentage of men that are dying in armed conflict is really high. So interestingly, you see for quite a bit of history, the real question is democracy stable? And even as late as the late 1700s, like if you read, say, the Federalist Papers, mostly what they're concerned about are things like political stability versus factionalism and the possibility of civil war and conflict. The other thing that you tend to see a lot of, especially in ancient Greek philosophy, but are also early kind of Western Christian philosophy and early Renaissance philosophy about government is, does this form of government make us better human beings? And what are the limits of that? So, there's this theory called perfectionism, which says that the fundamental purpose of government, or at least one of its fundamental purposes, is to make us better people, more virtuous people. And that view has definitely fallen out of favor in the past like 100 years or so. You find, I mean, I can think of, there's like 2 or 3 philosophers who defend this nowadays, but overwhelmingly people don't think it's the job of government to make us better people. They think it would be better if society had virtuous people in it, but it's just certainly not government's role. So that's what you see early on. And then you get transitioning to the modern era, you start seeing more concern about things like how well does government perform? Does it make us free? And does it make us equal? And the concern for equality as an inherent value is an especially recent thing. You don't see much of that until about 150 years ago.
Are there interesting insights about democracy from ancient and medieval thinkers, pro or con, that modern readers can benefit from?
What's surprisingly interesting is how the debates are really old. People say that like all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, and that's probably not really true. But when it comes to thinking about democracy, it's surprisingly close to accurate, because Plato brought up a lot of the things that we're worried about today. Does democracy, like in his view, he was quite negative about democracy, at least in a lot of his writings. There's always a question about how much is his real view versus what is he presenting for the sake of argument, or presenting that really belongs to someone else. But he's worried about democracy making us sort of enemies of one another, that the spirit of equality tends to make people like more vicious, because they stop believing that there's any such thing as epistemic authority. They don't believe that anyone knows better than anyone else. They start disrespecting their elders. They aren't willing to learn and make themselves better people. Because if you basically tell everybody, oh, we're all equal, then a lot of people interpret that as, great, then I have no reason to improve. After all, there's nothing better than me anyways. We're all equal. So why would I learn anything or make myself a better person? And he thinks this leads to sort of a really dysfunctional culture that eventually collapses on itself. He thinks even his best form of government will eventually collapse because of just problems of human nature. The worries about democracy being stupid and being led by demagogues, or people doing what feels good and sounds good rather than what is good. These are all old worries. And you see people debating that throughout the centuries. Even more contemporary things like, is it important that we rule over ourselves? Does democracy sort of are we freer in a democracy than in a non-democratic system because we have a say? People were talking about that 2,500 years ago. And so sometimes the arguments are surprisingly sophisticated. It is true that we know a lot more about democracy and its functioning than the ancients did, or people did 1,000 years ago, or even say the American founders. The American founders are engaged in informed speculation when they're designing the Constitution. They don't really know what they're doing because they don't have enough examples, things to work on. Whereas since then, we've had a couple 100 years and over 100 examples of democratic government to sort of really judge like what works and what doesn't.
Speaking of the American founders, how much does federalism play a role in debates about democracy outside of that context? I know they were writing simultaneously about democracy and federalism and how these things combine, and maybe they're natural complements. I think Jefferson wrote about, more local forms of government, and ward republics, I think he called them, are going to be more likely to approach unanimity, so that makes them better allies to democracy or something. But I don't know if other older writers cared very much about this concept. Did they?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in a way, older writers didn't worry that much about it because states used to be very small. So if you're talking about,
Oh yeah, that's true.
Years ago, with Athens, it's, we shouldn't understate how small it was. It had a pretty large geographic area in the Attican region that was controlled by Athens. But nevertheless, in a way, we're just talking about tens of thousands of people. I forget what the max population was of that area. Like, it was controlled by Athens, but it's definitely like under 200,000. And the majority of people don't have any say in the government anyways. So in a way, they weren't as concerned with this because politics was kind of local. It was a lot of city states. It's not until you get to like the Roman Empire and so on that you start seeing in the West questions about, the nation as a whole and how to think about that. In a way, what you have nowadays is there's sort of a split where many people just take for granted that the locus of justice is the nation state. Like, for instance, a lot of egalitarians, people who believe in egalitarian material philosophy, that we should all have like roughly the same amount of wealth or income, they'll take it for granted that when they say we should have equal income, they mean we, the people of Canada, we, the people of the United Kingdom, we, the people of the US, we, the people of Sweden. And they're not often very concerned about the gap between income between, say, the average Swedish person and the average Haitian person. They'll just say, well, they're in different countries. countries. So, what matters is that they're equal inside those countries, not between them. And it's really puzzling why anyone would think that. The arguments for that view are surprisingly weak and often question begging. But despite people often taking this for granted, I think many philosophers nowadays have been pushing either for a lot of principles of justice seem like they should be at the global level, right? These are principles that apply to all rational agents who can interact with one another. So there's nothing special about nation states. Or alternatively, they think that a lot of these things apply to the more local level. And so you see often moves for devolving democracy down to something more local. I mean, one thing is people love to, when they want to talk about the success of democracy, they love to point to, say, Switzerland. And Switzerland has a lot of things going well for it, a lot of things that are maybe not as great as people think, and maybe things that aren't really replicable. It's not like I really doubt you could just turn the United States into Switzerland overnight. It's just a different kind of place. But one thing that makes Switzerland work as well as it does is that a lot of politics is done at the local level, where it's sort of easier to figure out what needs to be done, and we have a higher stake in getting it done. Right? It's kind of like being part of a pool club in my neighborhood. Well, we can see whether the pool needs to be fixed, and we all have a stake in that pool being fixed. It's a lot different from just national level concerns where my vote has so little power and it's so distant from any actual outcome that I might as well use my vote expressively and so on.
Yeah, where the biggest practical impact of your political activity is going to be how well you get along with your neighbors because you voted Republican or Democrat and
right,
et cetera. The word democracy has had a lot of different connotations and meanings over time, and it used to be looked at more unfavorably, or at least the word democracy did. But just putting aside the word and the semantic issue and just thinking about the substance, older writers had more issues with democracy. Did they have issues just with this idea of like mob rule, or do you think that there are substantive concerns that like ancient and medieval writers would have had with what modern democracies actually look like, basically governments with large but still constrained roles for majority rule with pretty broad suffrage?
Yeah, great. I mean, think about, you just take Aristotle and Plato as two debate partners. Keeping in mind that for those who don't know, Aristotle was Plato's student, and was also Aristotle was also Alexander the Great's tutor as well. So Plato definitely worried. Like Plato and Aristotle are both using the word democracy in a pejorative way, where to use like Aristotle's old division from the Politics, he would say there's sort of a functional and dysfunctional form of each kind of government. The rule of the one is called monarchy when it's working well, and dictatorship or tyranny when it's working badly or corrupted. We call it aristocracy, the rule of the few when it's working well, and oligarchy when it's working badly and being kind of run in a corrupt way. And then we call it democracy when the rule of the many is working badly and is corrupt. And then the question of how you translate the word that he used into modern English, people sometimes say constitutional government or polity, or they'll say republic, though he didn't use the word that way, when it's working well. And then nowadays people use the word democracy as an umbrella term to refer to all sorts of different kinds of government, including what the founding fathers would have called a constitutional republic, and including majoritarian rule, including everything else. So Plato, he was worried about polarization, about people like being led by emotion, about them being highly ignorant and misinformed and irrational. He was worried that like democratic politics was ultimately going to be swayed by stupid passions. In any given moment, people are going to be inflamed, they're incensed, they're going to do what sounds good, and then they're not going to really think through the consequences of their actions. Aristotle, his kind of favored form of government was something that sort of split the difference between what was good about the rule of experts and what was good about the rule of the many, where maybe you're gonna have a somewhat divided government, but ultimately you're giving a lot of people a say because two heads are better than one, but you're not giving people unlimited power in order to make sure that they just don't act like idiots all the time. And so I think a lot of debates nowadays come down to this question of, can you trust the people or not? Right. And so that comes in the question of performance. How well does democracy perform compared to various alternatives?
You mentioned at the beginning, describing the book, that it's an intellectual history going back 2,500 years about, what Western thinkers have thought about democracy. Is the focus on the West, I'm assuming just because there isn't writing on democratic theory outside of the West until, I don't know, the last 100 years or something. Is that right? Or are there?
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's not, there are cases where people might go, for this particular topic, does it really make sense simply to focus on kind of Western philosophers and Western thinkers, or is that kind of sort of a cultural chauvinism? And that often is a really good objection, but just historically speaking, there hasn't been that much democracy in the West, but insofar as there has been like democracy is largely a Western invention, and the philosophizing about democracy is largely Western. So it's not that there isn't anything outside the West, but the majority of it is inside that West. And so even with the experiences of democracy expanding, it's kind of a Western form of government that other places start to adopt in the 20th century and later. So yeah, I think focusing on the West if you wrote like a world history of democracy and a Western history of democracy, it would look roughly the same.
That's what I assumed. One question you address is whether democracy makes us wiser or not, or at least whether democracy facilitates wiser decision making. Maybe that's the same thing. What are some ways that might happen?
Yeah. So one idea is just this. The basic worry is that when you have power concentrated in the hands of the few, people tend to be pretty selfish and they're going to use that power for their own benefit. And so there's this kind of market type analogy that you see with thinkers like Bentham and James Mill, the father of John Stuart Mill, and a lot of early liberal philosophers, where they say, well, kind of what a democratic government is it's sort of like a market, right? You want power. You're a politician. You're not necessarily a virtuous or great person, but you want power for yourself. And in order to get that power, you have to sell yourself to customers called voters. And they're only going to vote for you if you do a good job and promote their interests. So the thought is, if everyone's kind of a rational, self-interested person and they're trying to promote their own interests, then when they go to the voting booth, they're going to look for the person who's sort of offering them the best overall deal. Everyone's sort of doing this at the same time. And as a result, we have to kind of compromise with one another. And so under a democratic form of government, you're getting politicians who ultimately are going to give the people something that's pretty good for them. Now, admittedly, it might not mean serving everybody. Admittedly, it might mean that like small minorities get ignored because they just don't have much sway. But at least you're going to have something like a compromise among large groups of people. And so government will tend to serve large groups of people's interests better than other alternative systems. And if you do a bad job as the elected politician, then we'll get rid of you. We'll replace you with somebody else. So you have a really strong incentive to like actually perform. And so this is often a kind of basically taking what's supposed to be the logic of the market and arguing that it applies to politics as well. That's one kind of argument that people often make. Another kind of argument is that, well, maybe we're not just self-interested, egoistic agents, but we actually do care about things like justice and other highfalutin values. But we, I shouldn't say highfalutin, I should say high-minded values, because highfalutin means like nonsensical, like the stuff that I was complaining about earlier. So we're going to get together and deliberate. And when we deliberate, we'll be able to see one another's point of view and the reasons for things. And maybe we'll be able to reach some sort of consensus about what ought to be done. Right. And just a final idea about the wisdom of democracy is the idea that maybe two heads are better than one. Sometimes the crowd has lots and lots of wisdom spread out among the group. So an example of this would be, or a classic example would be, I was at this like post-performance carnival for some performance that one of my kids was in the other day, and they had that game where you can guess the number of pieces of candy inside of a jar. Right. So you might have heard this kind of thing where if you ask, I have a jar and I say, how many pieces of candy are in here? And I ask you, you might guess, say 250. Someone else will guess 350 or whatever. It turns out for this particular type of task, the more and more people you have guess, as you average their answers together, the average answer becomes closer and closer to the truth. So even though any particular person is going to be wildly off, like overestimating by 100%, underestimating by 80%. As we add more people, the average guess becomes almost certainly likely to be correct. This works for things like how much does a pig weigh, and a few other kinds of problems. So for reasons like this, some people think that, well, two heads are better than one, maybe three heads are better than two, and maybe an infinite number of heads is better than any finite number. So perhaps under certain decision-making conditions, the group will be smartest as a whole if we add more and more people. So those are kind of the main arguments that people give in favor of thinking democracy is wise.
And I'm guessing that there's more to it than this, but for the candy guessing example, the strength there is that you have a relatively simple question for which errors are likely to be more or less random. But if you have a question where errors are not, you don't have good reason to think the errors will be random. The errors might be concentrated in a particular direction, in which case, and I think you say this in the book, more heads might actually be worse, and they might average to an answer that's reliably further from the truth.
Yeah, that's right. So imagine As an analogy, when we go to guess the candy, suppose that there was like this weird sociological phenomenon when it came to candy guessing. For some reason, people have a lot of social pressure to always guess 100. And then that's roughly half of people. And the other people have this weird social pressure to always guess 300. Okay. And then we do the candy game. Well, the answers are going to be crap. It's like highly unlikely that the number of candy works out to be the average that group would get. Because in this case, people are not guessing independently, they're just copying one another. Or suppose it's just like you're the first person to guess, and we kind of find out how much you guess, and we really want to impress you and follow you. We think of you as a thought leader, so we just copy your guess. If that happens, then this thing isn't going to work. And in fact, those two sociological pressures I just described, they don't occur in candy guessing, but they do occur in politics. So we don't actually see this kind of randomization of attitude. Or suppose when people get up there and we're like, how many pieces of candy are in there? They don't even guess candy. They just like write, they write the word cat or something. They don't even like actually participate in the way we want them to. Then we're not likely to extract much wisdom from them. Right. So yeah, it is a question of, are errors in politics, are errors randomly distributed, or are people independent of one another, or are they just following one another, and so on?
I think it's the section on wisdom, because the book goes through like various broad values and it has a pair of chapters each. Is democracy good for wisdom? Is it good for virtue, stability, etc.? And I think it's in the section on wisdom where you're exploring some skepticism about democracy, and you're referencing some of Hayek's work, and you ask something like, are we even asking the right question when we compare democracy to other forms of government? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think this is a really important insight. And it's surprising how few democratic theorists even occurs to them to ask this question, even today. Like, it just doesn't appear in their books. So throughout most of history, it's like, well, what's the smartest form of government? Would it be the rule of experts? Would it be the rule of the people, the rule of a king, the rule of something else? And then Hayek comes along and he says something that economists have said, but he says it more explicitly. He's like, that's often not the right question at all. One question is whether this should even be within the political realm. It might just be that the political realm is too stupid to handle this question. Right. So Hayek's famous 1945 paper on the use of knowledge in society, it's a bit hard to read, but the upshot of that paper is that there isn't such a thing as a political system that's smart enough to do what markets do. Right. Markets allocate prices and they determine prices of things, and they allocate resources in a fairly efficient way and tell people sort of what's useful for them to do for work and what's useful to produce and where. And what he basically economists learned in the 20th century through some theoretical work followed by some empirical work is that you're not going to have a substitute from that. Like, democracies are too stupid to do what markets do. Oligarchies are too stupid. Aristocracies are too stupid. ChatGPT is too stupid. So asking which form of government best handles this is often the wrong question, because sometimes it's not a role for government at all. Sometimes it should be left to the market, or sometimes it should be left to civil society, where by civil society, I just mean the ways people associate with one another voluntarily, but not through market mechanisms of paying each other for work, and not through government. So like a volunteer organization and so on. Sometimes those things are the better alternative. So if you really care about, if your idea is like the wisest decision-making process should be in charge of this, sometimes asking should it be a king or a democracy is the wrong question, because sometimes the answer is neither. It should be the market or something else.
Or civil society. And that word gets used, and I don't know if it's where it comes from or if it always means, when I hear that, I think maybe the word civil makes me think civic, and that's a mistake. But it essentially just means what you said, the social organizations that aren't, what you would normally think of as government or market.
Basically, de Tocqueville, with this famous book called Democracy in America. And, there's a question of how accurate this book is. Like, he didn't spend that much time in the US. He didn't visit that many places. He mostly hung out with certain intellectuals in like Newton, Mass and elsewhere. I don't want to like overstate his wisdom, but he claims in Democracy in America that the greatest virtue of democracy is not the quality of the decision making itself in politics. He thinks, in fact, it's quite stupid. He doesn't even think that the United States in the year 1836 is a particularly free place. He actually thinks it's surprisingly unfree. He thinks that people bully and mob each other constantly into conforming to one another's opinions. He thinks that France, despite having maybe weaker free speech laws, is actually a much more liberal speech country than the United States is. However, he says, the big virtue that the US has, because it's democratic, is people have this I can do it myself attitude that he thinks is part of democratic culture. So he thinks the difference between, say, the French and the Americans in the year 1836 would be if something bad is happening in France, people think, oh, we need to get the government to fix this. In the United States, they think, you know what? We all care about this. Why don't we form an association and put our money together and our time and our effort and fix it ourselves? And then they actually do. So he thinks like the wisdom of democracy is not the politics, but rather democracy leads to increased civil society, which in turn is quite wise and makes a lot of good decisions and performs quite well.
And even if he's accurate in all, identifying all of these civic associations, I think you point out that, he doesn't have the data or the tools to answer the question which direction that causation is going, or if there's causation at all.
Yeah, that's right. It is highly speculative. He certainly is not doing the kind of work we would insist upon by if a political scientist today wanted to make that argument, they'd have to do much more sophisticated work. And there are some papers trying to test this thesis and saying like, yeah, maybe it is correct. Maybe it is the truth that like when countries become more democratic, as a result, you get more sort of civic associations and things. There are people who think it goes the other way, where maybe the United States had a particular kind of culture which led it both to become more democratic and also to have these sorts of associations. It could also be the kind of thing where maybe this was true in the 1800s, but it's less obviously true now, because people turn more and more to the idea of like government should fix things. So there's a question, like when people see problems, what's their reaction? Is it I should fix it, or we should fix it voluntarily, or is it the government should fix it? Like we need, the authority figure to come in here and fix these things.
Yeah, my assumption from that description would be that if that really was a big feature of the United States at the time, that Americans were more likely to form various organizations and try to fix problems themselves, it would probably have more to do with, a lack of a strong central state reliably trying to solve these problems, whether successfully or just getting in the way. And, if people are allowed to try to solve their own problems and no one else is doing it for them, they probably will, or at least they'll try.
Yeah. But even in the US today, you find a large number of these kinds of volunteer organizations. So I think about, let's say, a high school, just a typical like high school in the US. It's likely to have a booster program for every major thing the school does after school. Like they have a theater program. Well, there's going to be the theater boosters, and the people get together and raise money. They have football. There'll be the football boosters who'll raise money. So you do have a high proliferation of these kinds of things. It's not clear that you see this as much in other countries. So one of the maybe problems with this hypothesis is that many countries became democratic after the United States, and they didn't really copy this sorts of behavior, which starts to look like maybe there's just something unusual about the U.S. as opposed to it's like de Tocqueville's thesis that democracy was making the U.S. be like this.
Mm-hmm. One of the other values you try to investigate is liberty and how democracy contributes to liberty. But there's also this interesting thing where people identify, one question might be, does democracy promote this independent value we call liberty? And another question might be, is democracy just a form of liberty?
Right.
Can you talk about the different ways people think about the relationship between liberty and democracy?
Yeah, I think those are really the two essential ways. Is democracy itself a form of freedom? Are you free simply because you're democratic? Or rather, by freedom, do we mean things like you have certain kinds of rights of free speech and a right to make contracts, a right to choose your own profession, and then it might just turn out democracy, in fact, tends to protect that better than other values. So let's think of the first kind of thing first. So when you think about, say, the American Revolution and people saying, oh, we're now a free country, or when people say this is a free country, often what they just mean is democratic. And they mean something like, you're free because you get a right to a say in what the government is. Maybe the government interferes a lot with your life. Maybe it taxes you at a high rate and puts on a lot of paternalistic laws. Maybe you don't actually have a high sphere of personal freedom, but you get a say. And people will still think of that as free in a way that, so they don't just mean free as liberal, they just mean free as democratic. Why would they think that? And so oftentimes people say things like, in a democracy, there's something special about the way the government works because you are in part the author of the law in a way that you're not in a monarchy. In a monarchy, the rules are just imposed upon you from on high, but in democracy, the laws are things that we set for ourselves in some way, and you're part of that we. So you're in a way freer than you otherwise would be. Right. So that's kind of the argument that people make, and they'll try to think about that in lots of different ways and make it more plausible if they can. But there's a lot of worries about this, of course. One is that it's not really obvious that like you having much of a say means anything. So I'll just, there's so many arguments against this, but I'll just like use something from Robert Nozick. The libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick has this famous thought experiment from Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And to sort of go through it quickly, he says, I want you to just imagine that you're a slave, and then I want you to raise your hand when you stop being a slave and finally become free. And he just has these changes over time. Like step one, you're a slave, you have a master, the master does whatever the hell he wants to you, he beats you whenever he feels like it. Step two, he writes some rules on the board and says, I'm only going to beat you and punish you if you violate these rules. And in fact, he sticks to it. Now, he's free to change the rules at any point, but he doesn't. And in fact, he sticks to it. Step three, the master says, you know what? Having you work on my plantation isn't really that valuable to me. Why don't you go live in the city and you can take any job you want there. And all you have to do is send me 4/7 of your income back, and you can keep the rest for your own living expenses. However, I can recall you back to the manor at any point if I want to, but he never does. And then step four, he dies. And when he dies, he does something weird. He has 10,001 slaves, including you, and he leaves his property right in all 10,001 slaves to 10,000 of the slaves except for you. So now the 10,000 slaves own everyone, each other, and you, but you don't have any ownership rights. And he says, you might think you're free at this point, but not really, because all that's happened is you've replaced your one-headed master with a 10,000-headed master. Pretty much the same thing. So then over time, like the slaves, other slaves, they make these decisions about what to do with themselves and you. And once in a while, they ask for your opinion. They're like, you know what? Maybe you have some insight about how what rules should we make? Like, what can we eat? Where do we live? How can we work? Et cetera, et cetera. So they'll ask for your opinion from time to time. And after a while, because you offer such good advice, they say, we're going to give you a special deal. Whenever we are completely indifferent, whenever we're not sure what to do, whenever we're literally split 5,000 to 5,000, we're going to ask your view. So what they'll do is they'll have you write down your view about what should be done, and they put it on a piece of paper. And if they ever split 5,000 to 5,000, they open up the envelope and read the piece of paper and do what you said. Nozick says, maybe you think you're free at this point, but in a way that's still like having a 10,000-headed master who lets you do whatever you want when he's indifferent. So finally, they say, after like a few years of this, they've never actually split 5,000 to 5,000. So they just throw your vote in with everyone else's. He's like, look, obviously your situation is better than just being a slave on a plantation being whipped by like a cruel master. But there's a really important way in which you're not all that free. And none of us are, because what happens in democracy is we are all under the control of a collective. The collective functions as sort of a separate entity from the people that are part of it. So, a good way to sort of test your autonomy is, does your decision making have real efficacy over what happens in your life? Like, I decided this morning that I would wear a gray t-shirt that says the word wicked and is made up of license plates from the New England area, which I bought from chowderheads.com, which has some cool New England memorabilia type stuff. So I decided that, and lo and behold, here it is on my body. I also decided this morning that the sun would turn purple. And viewers aren't like looking outside at the same time we are, but I'm going to just promise you it didn't turn purple despite my decision. So when I think about democratic decision making, which is it closer to? It's closer to the sun turning purple. Like, I can vote however I want and nothing ever happens. Or maybe one other illustration of this, which I think is really cute. A few years ago, during the last election, the fast food or fast casual chain Nando's Peri Peri, which I think is a great restaurant, like great food. I like it. I recommend it. They had a little stunt they did as a PR thing where I think it was in New York or something. People would walk in and they'd say, would you like to order the undemocratic meal? And if you ordered the undemocratic meal, what happened was the manager or a worker would just make you something really weird and feed it to you. Like, all right, we had a brownie with a slab of chicken on it and some like garlic sauce and like soda dumped on it, like something really gross. And they go, aha, undemocratic meal. And they're right. Like, okay, that's an undemocratic meal because one person plays dictator. They make the food and just give it to you. And that's what you get. And you don't have a say. So that is indeed undemocratic. But what they didn't offer was a democratic meal. Instead, the alternative was a market meal. A market meal is you walk in there and tell them what you want and they give it to you. Right. So I'm like, I would like chicken with like the extra hot sauce. And my wife would be like, I want the chicken with the mild sauce because we have different tastes. That would be a market meal. A democratic meal would be you go into Nando's Peri Peri and you tell them what you want. And then they ask everyone else who also wants Nando's Peri Peri what they want. And then whatever the majority wants, everyone gets. Now, you definitely have more freedom when you get one of a million says rather than zero say, but it's not that much freedom, is it? Right. So it's like less like having an equal slice of cake and more like having an equal crumb. You're like, I have, instead of having zero influence, I only have vanishingly small influence. Is that freedom? I mean, maybe, but it's not something to get that excited about.
What are some the most common objections that modern democratic theorists have about modern democracies? I mean, you're offering various criticisms, possibly from a view that might be skeptical of democracy, either in favor of other types of government or in favor of the market or a smaller role for the political sphere at all. But what are some of the ways that modern democratic theorists believe that modern democracies fall short?
Yeah, good. Good question. If what it's worth, keep in mind in this book, we were often, I'm right now talking about like arguments I find more persuasive and more powerful, but
Yeah.
the book doesn't take a stance on these things per se.
Yeah, it's clear that you're reporting on a large literature historically and contemporarily, and this isn't Jason Brennan's perspective. There are many books that give that though.
Yeah. Just for what it's worth. Yeah. In a way, I think what you tend to see among modern Democrats is the idea that the problem with democracy is that it's not democratic and equal enough, right? So they look at democracy and say every democracy as we find it is not really truly democratic or truly equal, and they're right about that. Think about your typical modern democracy excludes a number of people from voting, like children, resident immigrants who've lived there for a long time, people who are like psychologically invalid in some way. Felons are often excluded from voting in different countries. So people who are subject to the law but don't have a say in it, or they might say things like, really, because like for instance, a person I often have a debate with, Helen Landemore, will say, well, Bren, you'll talk about how democracy isn't really free because you have very little power, but the people as a whole have very little power because government is mostly run by entrenched experts or entrenched bureaucrats. So I live in the DC area. If I wave my arm to point at my neighbors, I am pointing at the US government. It's like this general from the Space Force lives catty corner to me, and then across the street from me is someone who works for the State Department, and next to him is someone who is a CIA agent, and then over here are two people who work for the State Department, and so on. My congressperson's just down the street. These are the people who actually run the country. They're the ones that actually have power. Like, it's true that, like, so when someone like says, oh, I mean, you get to have a vote every 4 years that has a vanishingly small chance of making a difference, they might agree and say, yeah, that's the problem. We need to make a democratic system where the people have more power. It's not actually clear to me that any of their solutions mean that you get more power or I get more power, but rather what they end up meaning is that the collective mass of people has more power as compared to politicians or bureaucrats. So often that's their complaint. And sometimes they'll use democracy as an argument for making things more economically equal. A lot of democratic theorists are really convinced that if you make 10 times as much money as I do, then there's no way we can be politically equal, that's always going to translate into an objectionable form of political equality. I often think that that's motivated by the people writing this are really more concerned about economic egalitarianism than they are about democratic theory. And this is just sort of their way to get the result they want. But there you go.
Well, and you point out that some of the people for whom that is very explicitly a concern go another direction, a very undemocratic direction. You give Lenin, I think, as a major example of someone whose obvious main concern is something more material form of egalitarianism. Though I think he maybe ostensibly believes he's a Democrat of some kind.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And many critics of democracy, as we see it, have been people who call themselves democratic in some way. And they're sincere. I think they're wrong, but they're genuinely sincere. Their view is like, well, this political system we have, like Lenin and Marx would say something like this. The political systems as we see them are not really free. They're truly a kind of oligarchy where moneyed interests control government and pretend that it's equal. They're pretending that like they're responding to the interest of all. And so they're like, what we need to do is like reduce the power of the moneyed interests. And for some reason, their solution is what that means is having a strong group of people, or maybe one strong person who can sort of discern what is good for the people and give it to them. And you see that throughout history. Like one of my colleagues just posted a point about this with regard to, say, Donald Trump, and he's a critic of Donald Trump. But he wrote this op-ed that was in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, and he said, so many Democrats think that Donald Trump is the enemy of democracy. But what's Donald Trump's argument? He's like, Washington doesn't work for the people. It has all of these procedural constraints, and I'm here to give the people what they really want and override these constraints to do what the people in fact want. Now, maybe Trump's sincere about that. Maybe he's not. His point is that's a pretty common view among democratic theorists, that like we have to get rid of these constraints and just give the people what they really want. And you'll often see this weird thing that happens where historically, I mean, all across the world right now, you see these kind of populist movements that have this form. We have a central government. Nominally, it's democratic and it's supposed to work for the people as a whole. But in fact, you get these entrenched interests of the alphabet agencies or the various like councils or whatever you have in different countries, that they run the government for their own benefit and for the benefit of their friends. And then the people rise up and rebel against that. And their way of rebelling against it is to try to find a strong man who will overthrow those people for their benefit.
You were mentioning this
very sincere.
Yeah, and whether they're sincere or not, they are at least appealing to democracy because it's appealing to people.
Yeah.
Even if they're not sincere, what they say, what they believe, other people will find inspiring is telling. You mentioned the success of Switzerland as an example earlier of democracy. As far as you know, has Switzerland had any of these kinds of concerning populist movements that other countries in Europe or the United States has had, or have they skipped out on that?
Yeah, I was actually in Switzerland a few months ago and talked to a lot of people, and they claim that, oh, things are not quite as great as you think. We do have these sorts of problems, or we don't have that much participation at the national level. And so a lot of what ends up happening is national politics is ruled by people with like a stronger degree of information and maybe more interest than others. We don't really have the kind of democratic utopia that people think we do. Or perhaps one of the issues is how much of Switzerland is just based upon it. In a way, it's it's a multilingual place, it's a multicultural place, but at the same time, so like when you go to Switzerland, if you go say their national museum or something like that, they're like, look at how multicultural and open we are, and you're like, in a way, you really are, right? You are this federation of like different cultures that kind of got together and made something work. But on the other hand, you're really not. Switzerland, despite having a high immigrant population, it really is kind of a special sort of weird place that is not as multicultural as the US or Canada or a lot of bigger countries where you have much more diverse groups of people working together in different ways. So one question is like, is it just like it's working because it's small? Is it working because it's devolved? Is it working because it has some sort of cultural weirdness to it that you can't really replicate elsewhere? I mean, why is it we think about, say, multilingual countries that work together? Why is it Switzerland works so well and like Belgium's kind of a mess? Sorry to all my Belgian friends out there, but they probably would agree. So why is it like having a multilingual government so effective in one place and not in the other? And I think we don't really know the answer to this.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman, and I just wanted to take a break to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for listening to these episodes and giving me the opportunity to speak with people I admire and read amazing books every week, every other week, whatever. If you are interested in helping this little engine that could of a show grow, please just recommend it to a friend. Recommend it to a friend. Maybe give it a 5-star rating on one of those places you listen to it at. But really, if you just recommend it to someone, that goes a long way for a small show like this. So thank you again. Thank you for listening. Keep listening. And back to the show. Let's switch gears. What is democratic backsliding?
Democratic backsliding is the idea that like in the past 50 years or so, or perhaps especially in the past 20 years, that the amount, really in the past 20 years, like the number of democracies is getting smaller. Countries are becoming less democratic rather than more democratic. Even the countries that are democratic are not as democratic as they were before. So people try to come up with various measurements of how democratic countries are, and they'll put it on like a scale of like 1 to 10 or something. And they'll say that like, okay, so maybe there were 95 countries that qualified as democratic in this year, and the average score of those countries was like an 8.4. And now there's only 90 or 85 countries, and the average score is like a 7.8. So a nice example, this would be, say, the United States, which after Trump got downgraded a whole bunch, though whether it really got less democratic or whether that's just experts hate Trump, so they decided to like downgrade us in response to him is a good question. I mean, I hate Trump too. Don't get me wrong. Like, just I don't want anyone to think I'm like defending him. Like, but I do worry that a lot of this, we're less democratic because Trump was elected, was kind of just a bullshit ideological move, not really a serious thing.
But it's an international trend, though. This isn't just based on. I mean, you're giving the example of the United States, and maybe there are individual cases of. I know that some of the indices that rank democracy or freedom or whatever I'm sure that there's variance in the quality of what kinds of data goes into those. And some of the data may be vulnerable to that kind of ideological blowing where the winds go, like some of it's based on polling probably, but some of it's based on more objective like policy data. And I don't know which is which.
Yeah,
Um,
I think it's yeah, it really is questionable. And so I don't want to say that there's, even though lots of people talk about this, I don't want to say there's a consensus that it's happening. And you will find papers published in mainstream political science journals challenging this view and saying like, well, the data is wrong, or you're counting it the wrong way, or it's really questionable. But nevertheless, there is this widespread belief in democratic backsliding. And part of it has to do with there really were from like 2015 through pretty recently a large number of these populist movements throughout Europe and elsewhere, that just like people saying we're fed up with the central government, we don't think it responds to our interests, and we want this strong person to come in and kind of take over the government for our on behalf of us. And they see that as democratic backsliding rather than, because you could go the other way. You go, oh, that's actually democracy working, right? The people think that the central government doesn't work, so they're getting someone to work for them.
is that the main change? Like what substantively have been the types of changes that go into the data showing democratic backsliding, or is it kind of nebulous to determine what
Yeah,
it is?
sometimes you have things that really are like that really do seem plausible, like take like say places like Hungary or Turkey, where they might change the constitution in ways that sort of entrench current power holders or eliminate judicial review or so on, or weaken the power of judicial review. But even then, that's another philosophical question. Does that count as pro or anti-democratic? Because keep in mind, a large number of philosophers who consider themselves strong democratic advocates think that judicial review is anti-democratic. Their view is that the people should decide what happens, not some unelected judges. In fact, on this very point, kind of as an aside, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I went on Facebook and it's a little bit of trolling, but I really did mean this seriously. I was like, hey, democratic theorists, so many of you have published papers arguing that judicial review is bad and arguing that the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, is effectively an unelected super legislature that just create law without being accountable to the people. So when Roe v. Wade was overturned, what this super legislature effectively did was remove its own power. It said, rather than us deciding what abortion law will be, we're going to give this back to state legislatures, to the elected officials, to people who have been chosen by the people to decide the law. So you democratic theorists, you must be absolutely delighted that this was such a wonderful victory for democracy today, because now finally this really important question is in the hands of the people, as you democratic theorists say it should be. And most of them just got irritated with me and were pissed, but they really should go, yeah, I actually think that's true. They should say, yes, I think that, because that's what their published stuff says. And I want to say, to their credit, the one person who was like clear about this was like Hunlan Landamore. I asked her about this and she was like, yeah, I do think that this should be decided by state legislatures and not the US Supreme Court. So I agree that this was a victory for democracy. Good for her for having the guts to say that, because everyone else should be saying it, but they're too timid, because that's what their view implies.
Yeah, the honest answer seems to me obviously to be, because they're probably mostly more progressive leaning people. On the substance of it, they're going to believe that the people should be persuaded to be pro-choice, but their procedural political views are strongly democratic. And so these decisions should be decided by local or state legislatures or popular legislatures rather than unelected Supreme Courts. I mean, there's a tension there, but it's not a contradiction. But that, I imagine, would be a painful thing to admit, because then you have to say something that sounds like it's signaling I'm on the side of this issue, even though for different reasons that Donald Trump or the red team is. And that feels bad.
I mean, consider an example like that. Take the issue of gay marriage. So Massachusetts was the first state to legal, if I'm getting the facts right, if I remember, it was the first state to legalize gay marriage in the United States, but it did so because of a state Supreme Court decision. And then up north, on the border, New Hampshire decided it democratically. They just went through the state legislature, and then a Republican governor signed it into law. So you might think, well, look, there's something cool about New Hampshire. Granted, I'm from both Massachusetts and New Hampshire, so I'm talking about my split halves myself. There's something cool about New Hampshire compared to Massachusetts here, because Massachusetts effectively had this law imposed upon it by a small number of people, and New Hampshire chose this law, and it at least chose it more than other states did, right? Like a bunch of people voted for it and made it into law.
So speaking of democratic backsliding, the big news item that probably comes to a lot of Americans' mind is January 6th. So one thought that I have when I think about that is like, yes, this is an event that's obviously concerning, But I also have questions that I don't know the answer to, like how common are events like that across functional first world democracies? I really don't know. Like, is it really that rare? How concerned should we be when things like that happen? It doesn't seem to me like something like that would likely be successful in any big, scary way, but I mean, maybe it would be. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really hard to judge these things until, because people can point to historical precedents and say, oh, well, things like this have happened in the past. And the next thing you know, Hitler is in power permanently, right? Could it have been the case that had January 6th worked out a certain way, that Trump would have remained president in some way, that people would, like, decisions would have been stopped from being made, and that these decisions would be treated as if they had binding force? Because in a way, a lot of political change is illegal. Like, for instance, like take like the founding of the United States, like the replacement of the Articles of Confederation with the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah.
That's a bootstrapping kind of thing. It's not like the Articles of Confederation had clauses in it that said they could be replaced by the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution itself had a bunch of clauses that basically said, if the following happens, then it comes into force as authoritative. Well, that's kind of weird because it only has authority if it has authority, right? So, like, what makes these questions about when they have authority in the first place? The previous Constitution, called the Articles of Confederation, didn't have any provision for that, so it bootstraps its way in. So something like that could have happened. But it is true that we have riots in all sorts of different places, and mass protests and things like that. Storming the Capitol. I don't want to like downplay that, but it's on a continuum between that versus just like protesting outside on the streets. So do we really have to be like super exercised that it was like inside the Capitol building itself as opposed to being outside the Capitol building? Like, one, magically now we're really violating the sacredness of the Capitol as opposed to not. I mean, I do think it's incredibly tragic that a lot of police officers were injured and killed. So I don't want to downplay that sort of stuff, but I don't look at the U.S. Capitol building and treat it like a holy sacred space. So the fact that people went in there and took poops on people's desks and things like that doesn't bother me the way it does other people. The other thing is, like, the U.S. survived. I mean, we're still here. So one way of looking at January 6th is to say that the U.S. was tested and it passed.
That's kind of part of my question is, like, was this actually a close call, or is this something that, I mean, even putting aside the question of whether there was a genuine attempt higher up to turn this into something very, very nefarious, is it something that realistically could have happened anyway? And is this something that has been tried in other places, like, relatively frequently? And, here's a more specific question. Among modern countries that have been wealthy liberal democracies for at least decades, let's say several decades, what is the most concerning case you're aware of democratic backsliding? Because you mentioned Turkey and Hungary earlier, but neither of those, I don't know about Hungary, but Turkey's not an example of like a longstanding, stable liberal democracy. So I can imagine being worried about a new, fragile, poor democracy backsliding dramatically. But, like, are there examples of countries that are like, yeah, this country was a clear liberal democracy for decades, and then, oh my God, it's a dictatorship now?
And a dictatorship not because it was conquered by another country that made it.
Yes, that happened. Yeah. Nazi Germany did that, but, like, I don't know of other examples.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think we have any real examples like that, that where you have like a long-term stable democracy and then it becomes something non-democratic or genuinely non-democratic. The biggest worry would be, I think, if the U.S. became non-democratic and became something else, because we're very powerful. We have a huge military. We have a lot of influence on the world. So that's why, like, American politics is of interest to people in a way that, say, Norwegian politics is not. Nothing, no offense to Norway, just because of like size and power of influence. So in a way, American backsliding is more worrisome than other kinds of backsliding, just because of like how much the U.S. matters from a world scale, on a world level. But no, we don't have these examples of countries that were, democracies for a really long time and then suddenly stopped being democracies outside of being conquered by someone else.
That totally makes sense. About if, as an American or as anyone, that would concern me. On the other hand, I don't know. I mean, the United States is a democracy, and maybe that stops it from being tyrannical to other democracies, but it hasn't stopped it from being quite bellicose towards non-democracies and overthrowing other governments. So yeah. I don't know how much our democracy is saving the rest of the world. Are there any major issues related to democracy that you would have liked to raise in the book but couldn't for space reasons?
I really feel like we covered, the book covers the major important questions. I think what I really try to do in this book is like stick to the sorts of things that a real person would be concerned about. Does democracy make us more or less peaceful? Or is a democratic government more or less likely to collapse than other forms of government? How does it affect our character and our virtue and the way that we live as individual people and treat each other? Does it make good decisions that make our lives better or worse? Does it protect freedom? Is it itself a form of freedom? Does it matter that it makes us equal to one another in one particular respect, or is this like me an illusory thing? I think these are things that like the average person cares about, and so I really tried to cover what I thought were the sorts of things that a real person would be worried about. And so I feel like there is true that like when you do a book like this, there's so much writing that there's some obvious choices. Like it's kind of like writing if you had to do like what are the greatest rock hits since like if like take the 1960s, what are like the most important songs in the 1960s? Well, obviously you're going to put a lot of stuff from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Who and so on, but do you include this particular song by the Beatles, or do you like talk about the Mamas and the Papas or something like that? At a certain point, it becomes a lot of the questions are optional. Like, so it's true that like if someone else had written this book, they would have covered quite a bit of what I covered, but then maybe replaced this author with this other author, and they wouldn't have been wrong to do so, and I wouldn't be wrong to do what I did, because in a way, there's so much writing that we have to kind of pick the things that are obvious and then try to pick some things that are interesting but less obvious.
So all of the values that you're analyzing, how democracy comes to bear on liberty, equality, etc. So let's take one that I know will be of concern to you, liberty. You're a libertarian. So you could ask, does democracy promote liberty? I want to ask a more specific question. Are there variants of democracy and procedural rules that you're aware of that tend to be better at promoting liberty than other rules? Voting rules, or, proportional versus representation versus first past the post, these kinds of things. Are there variants of democracy that you've become more sympathetic to for that reason?
I think it's probably the case that federalism promotes it more than other things. Having rules that make it easy for people to move from one place to another. The right of exit is really important for protecting liberty. When people become trapped where they live, bad things happen. I think the right of exit is itself a most fundamental form of liberty, maybe even more fundamental than property rights and other things. But beyond that, just as an instrument, if people are free to move from one place to another, I think that helps protect liberty quite a bit. Having a lot of just constitutional constraints and things that slow down decision making, I think generally tend to protect freedom as compared to other things, in part because restrictions on liberty often come about during emergencies. Take like COVID as an example. Everyone's really scared about COVID, and regardless of whether you like the result of like what happened or not, you should agree to the following. During COVID times around the world, leaders who did not have actual power to do this imposed unilaterally a large range of restrictions on people's liberty in response to an emergency. Now, you might think those restrictions were justified, but you can still say, and you should say, yes, they were restrictions on liberty and they were done because of emergencies. So one thing that if you have constitutional constraints that are actually effective, a lot of what they do is prevent leaders from saying, we're in an emergency right now, I'm going to do something unilaterally. Because often what happens is when there's an emergency, governments expand their power quite a bit. And then when the emergency ends, they reduce it, but not all the way. This is what Robert Higgs calls the ratcheting effect of government. He talks about the size of government in terms of its fiscal spending, but I think something like that happens with regard to the scope of government power. Emergencies lead to increased power by government, and then when the emergency ends, governments reduce their power. It's like during the emergency, we increased our power by 20%, and then when afterwards we decreased it by 16 percentage points, and we're up by 4 percentage points.
That's a reason
over and over and over again.
That's a reason to be really concerned about global crises, because the US might go through a particular crisis and go through a ratcheting up of power and then not relinquish all of it. But you have things like world wars, the Great Depression, COVID. These are global crises where the entire world is probably experiencing this ratchet effect. I mean, obviously it did during COVID.
Right.
What is your next project? Are you working on anything at the moment?
Yeah, I've got a few things coming out. So one is this book called Questioning Beneficence with 3 other co-authors. It's going to be a new form of debate book in philosophy where there's 4 of us. We each come up with 3 basic questions about beneficence and effective altruism, giving, what it is to lead like a kind in life where you help others, what our obligations are. we ask 3 questions. We each answer those questions ourselves. The other people each give like a short response to those questions, and then we kind of debate them. And then we move to the next person who asks 3 questions. So rather than being what a lot of philosophy debate books are, where each person writes about 40,000 words in a brief response, we're continuously engaging with one another. And you'll even see us change our minds about things. Ryan Davis, one of my co-authors, said some things that makes me question what I think. And Richard Chappell and I say some things that makes Sam Arnold change his mind about something, and so on. So it's a genuine like debate with learning and open-minded in a way that most philosophy debates aren't. So that'll be coming out probably the end of this year.
And you're writing that in sequence, like the questions are coming one after another, and you're not going to go back and revise based on where the argument goes. So like we're watching kind of the debate in real time.
Well, in a way, we came up with the questions ahead of time, so everyone knew what the questions would be. So when we start writing our responses to everyone else, we've all seen what everyone else has already written to prevent the kind of like that kind of mess. But you do see in real time things like somebody writes, all right, here's an argument for a certain position, and then someone writes a response, and then when they write the response to the response, they say, you know what, I think you're probably right about that. Like I think my original argument didn't work, and you're right. And you almost never see that in philosophy. We should, but we don't see that, right? So there's that kind of thing. And, there's some other projects in the work, other kind of debate books and other projects, but that's the one that'll be, I think, out the soonest.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Do you have any recommendations that you want to give for books or authors to complement this volume, Democracy: A Guided Tour?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite books is Democracy for Realists by Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels. I think it provides a really good account of what's going on in democracy. Uncivil Agreement by Liliana Mason, I think, is really excellent. Hearing the Other Side by Diana Mutz. And I guess, in The Myth of the Rational Voter by Brian Kaplan. I think these are going to give you a pretty good empirical account of like how democracy really functions. It'll be kind of negative in the way, and the book much more negative, I think, than this book is, because this book really tries to be giving both sides like their best argument they can. But I would really recommend taking a look at those if you're interested in the empirical questions. If you're interested in the philosophy of democracy, that's a bit of a harder thing to really choose from. But there's an interesting book coming out called Intelligent Democracy that'll be out like in a month or so, I think. And I would take a look at that too. Like, it's into sort of a philosophical defense of democracy, but which is trying to engage with a lot of the skepticism that I've expressed.
Where can people find you if they want to keep up with your work?
I don't do Twitter or anything like that. So I guess they can't, right? They have to find me on these occasional types of things.
That's fine. You can find him on Amazon, get his books, and you've got a university webpage, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Perfect. My guest once again has been philosopher and Georgetown University professor Jason Brennan, and his book is Democracy: A Guided Tour. Jason, thanks so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.